Hi everybody, it is week 5. We're really moving along fast, don't you think? I'm glad you're all hanging in with me for this material that we're covering. It's really important material. It's important to be integrating all this material as we go along. And I think I've mentioned this in some announcements, but in case I haven't, I want to be clear about this. This course, which we call Foundations of Public Administration, is just that. It's really foundational literature, and as such, we are just scratching the surface. So there's a benefit to that. There's two benefits. One is that you get some of these foundational aspects that you apply to other classes. The second benefit is your term project, as I design it, is to explore some of these things in greater depth. And so hopefully everybody's using that opportunity to do so. So let me get into this material. There's really 3 parts to this. I'm going to talk about a little review from last week, and then I'm going to give you some things to think about from the readings this week, and then I want to talk just a little bit about the journal assignment for this week, week 5, as well as the discussion board assignment for week 5. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about, the 3 of the things we talked about last week, which were the Federalist Papers. Of course, there are a lot more Federalist Papers than you read, and you all understand that the purpose of the Federalist Papers, when they were written, was to advocate for adoption of the Constitution, particularly in New York State, because if New York State and Virginia, for example, had not ratified the Constitution, it's highly likely it would have fallen apart, even with 9 other states forming the new constitutional United States. If the most populous states, New York and Virginia, had not ratified, then I think the founders would have been back to square one. So the Federalist Papers by Madison and Hamilton and a few by John Jay were really advocacy pieces, op-ed pieces, if you will, in papers in New York to advocate for ratification. So, as such, what Madison and Hamilton hoped to do was persuade people that the Constitution was a really favorable direction for the new United States to go. So let's just kind of wrap up these 3 that we did read, and I want to throw some questions out there. In addition to the really great comments that everybody made on the discussion board, I just want to plant these in your thinking as well. So Federalist 10 is about faction. And really, what did Madison mean by faction? And here's his quote. He says, "By a faction I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse or passion or of interest adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community." So what did he mean by this? So what are the permanent and aggregate interests of the community? That's a really good question to ask. So he's saying that a faction would be opposed to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So he seems to be implying that there's some long-standing public interest that once in a while is interrupted by temporary passions. So then are factions temporary phenomena? And then what factions do you think Madison might have been talking about? Was he talking about political parties? Was he foreseeing them? Because it really was just a few years that political parties appeared on the scene. One group was called the Federalists, and one was called the Republicans, which actually, ironically enough, is the founding of the Democratic Party. Or was he talking about regional differences? That would be, in his context, North versus South. Was he talking about pro-slavery versus abolitionism? Was he talking about manufacturing versus agricultural, Republican versus Democrats? And that Republican versus Democrats there means people who favored a more Republican, small r, kind of government with representative democracy or direct democracy. And then, how are these factions controlled? Well, Madison pointed to two ways you could control factions, and he said you could remove the causes or remove the effect. And when he said remove the causes, what he really meant was you could just say, let's limit or destroy liberty, and that would mean you'd have an authoritarian government. Or you could give every citizen the same opinions, passions, or interests. So how do you do that? I mean, authoritarian governments do that as well, right? The approval rating for Kim Jong-un in North Korea is very high because theoretically every citizen believes in the revolution and has the same opinions, passions, or interests about the Kim family dynasty and the revolution. So that's one way of controlling factions. The other way is to remove the effect. And what he means by this is through the structure of a republic, the government structure, or by what we call interest group pluralism, which is an interesting term. And you might encounter this more when you talk about policy. Interest group pluralism, the idea that there are, in fact, interests, but they counterbalance each other. That's the theoretical view. Or, you could look at, again, going back to structure, national questions are resolved at some national level and state questions at the state level, and that interests balance against interests again, interest group liberalism. So that was Madison on interests. And then we moved on to Federalist 17, which was probably written by Hamilton. And so what did Hamilton say, or how did he say that state governments would prohibit the national government from asserting too much authority? This was an important question because the Anti-Federalists accused the writers of the Constitution of giving way too much power to the central government versus the state governments. So Hamilton said that the national government only had certain areas to administer, and he said these were commerce, finance, negotiation, and war. So the national government was supposed to regulate interstate commerce. It was supposed to regulate finance, meaning that there wasn't a central bank for some years, even though Hamilton would have favored one. But currency, there was to be common currency. The central government was to be the negotiating arm of the government. That is, it was to negotiate treaties. So Virginia couldn't negotiate a treaty with France. And then war, meaning that even though there were state militias, the idea in the Constitution was that states wouldn't be fighting states, and that states wouldn't declare war on, say, Great Britain and New York wasn't going to try to invade Canada on its own. So he said that the national government really only had limited portfolio, and the states retained the bulk of authority. For example, the bulk of criminal and civil justice authority. And that the people were naturally more attuned to the cultural loyalties and interests of their home states than they were to some distant national government. So, in other words, in all, Hamilton asserted in Federalist 17 that power is diffuse. It is not concentrated in the constitutional system. It is diffuse between the states and the national government. And so therefore, it would be impossible for the national government to assume too much power. So the question is, and I think a lot of you talked about this too in the discussion board, was Hamilton correct? And I just want to leave that there without answering it. Was Hamilton correct? And then we looked at Federalist 51, which could have been written by either Madison or Hamilton. And you'll see both names quoted when these quotes appear. But Federalist 51, the heart of it is, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections of human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. So what does he mean by that? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. I think a couple of you at least commented on this, in at least in some forms of theology, I think Christian theology, and I think also in other theology, Jewish theology and Muslim theology, there's this idea that there were fallen angels, angels who rebelled against the Almighty. So maybe angels aren't so great after all. But the idea is that everybody has the same thoughts, and if everybody has the same thoughts, why would you need a government? And that makes a bit of sense. So what Federalist 51 is saying is that government must be structured to achieve balance. Federalist 51 actually does assert that the legislative authority in a democracy naturally predominates. That is to say that they maybe were thinking that the legislative authority would predominate the executive authority. And so they designed two houses in the Constitution so that there wouldn't be a unicameral legislature that would turn into sort of legislative dictatorship. They saw the executive, in Federalist 51 anyway, as the weakest branch, and so gave it the veto power. So is it still true that the executive is the weakest branch? That actually maybe started changing right away, in as early as 1800. And then the judicial was indeed appointed by the other two branches, but held lifetime tenure, so it had that advantage over the other two branches. And then finally, government was to be federal. And this does mean more than just three branches of government. In the original constitutions, the state, the Senate represented states, not people. So recall that. The Senate was not elected to represent the people. It was elected by state legislatures to represent states. And in the original Constitution, the president was elected, in effect, by state legislatures. So really, the president was elected indirectly. There wouldn't the kind of campaigning we see today would be completely foreign to Madison and Hamilton. They would really have a hard time believing our presidential campaigns today, because they didn't design the system to work that way. So that's just a short review from last week. Let's move on to this week. Before I do though, one little thing just to look at. The idea of which dominates, state governments or the national government. This is kind of an indication of, the growth of the federal government vis-a-vis the states. So this chart goes all the way back to 1940, the beginning of World War II, and in the New Deal era. And the top line has non-health programs, grants from the federal government, and the bottom line has health programs, grants from the federal government. And so what you see really in both cases is that this number starts growing tremendously in about 1965. Well, in 1965, the Medicaid legislation was passed, and so most of these dollars going to states in health programs are Medicaid dollars. But there's non-health programs as well. There's a lot of grants that are non-health programs. So what this indicates to us is that prior to 1940, the national government was not financially involved or invested in the states to a very great extent at all. And this grew after World War II, but primarily after the mid-1960s. So this might help you answer the question, which level of government predominates? So given all that, the three readings I had to read this week, the one by Rohr, one by Spicer and Terry, and one by Stivers. So the question is, how do the works, the Rohr, Spicer and Terry, and Stivers works illuminate our current understanding of the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and the founding era of the United States and public administration? I'm going to get to the discussion and the journal in just a second here, but here's some things to think about as you consider Rohr. So, what is legitimacy versus legality in Rohr's thinking? Where does sovereignty reside in Rohr's thinking? Is the legislator supreme in the U.S. Republic? We talked about that a moment ago. What does Rohr mean when he's discussing officers and representatives? What's Rohr talking about when he says there are other ways to confer legitimacy? Are elections the only way to confer legitimacy? Why is Rohr critical of Wilson? And how does Rohr interpret Goodnow, our two of our favorites from week 2? And how is public administration an invention of the Constitution and thus legitimized? So moving on to Spicer and Terry. What do they say about this idea of a romanticized view of the founders that they accuse Rohr of holding? What do they mean by a logic of a constitution? Why do Spicer and Terry reject this idea of idealism? What are some of the criticisms they level against the founders? And then that brings us to what is the definition of a constitution according to them? And what are some rational reasons why the Constitution was written? And in their way of thinking then, how is public administration legitimized? So then let's think about Stivers and what she says. What are some blind spots that the founders possessed? What does Stivers say about the founders as instrumentalists? Remember that word? She talks about them as instrumentalists. How did the founders compromise on the subject of equal rights for blacks and women? So then, though, how does Stivers criticize the rationalism of Spicer and Terry? And what does Stivers have to say about the Constitution as a principle and not just a blueprint? And how does Stivers say that power is personal? And finally, in Stivers' view, how does she say public administration is legitimized? And how should public administrators respond? Okay, so I think you're seeing a theme here. And I kind of construct this week so that you can get at all of this. And one part you're going to do it through the discussion board, and the other part you're going to do it through a journal. So here's what I want you to do for the discussion board this week. I just want you to pick one of these readings. There's 3 readings. I want you to pick one of them. And then as usual, please present a critique or questions to a couple of classmates, and then you yourself respond to one critique or question. So for one author, here's what I want you to answer. I want you to talk about at least 2 major points the author makes initially. And then I want you to decide if those major points are adequately supported with evidence and how they are supported. And then I want you to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the article. And then finally, I want you to talk about the implications for public service practitioners or for administrators. What's that author saying? And so the second part of this week then is the journal. So this is our second journal. Most everybody did a really good job on the first journal. The second journal gives you a chance to be even more reflective. And I set it up with this discussion of, we often hear talk of unelected judges who make decisions affecting average citizens at all levels of government. We hear that the so-called Common Core learning criteria for K-12 education is flawed because these standards were dreamt up by some unaccountable bureaucrats in Washington who know nothing of local schools. And at the local level, we can read letters to the editor of any local news source and see complaints such as lazy city road workers not fixing potholes. And we also know that police departments in the United States have come under sharp criticism during the past few years for using unnecessary force, including lethal force, against minority citizens. So these are a few examples. They're examples of public administrators or public service practitioners, if you will, in action. And you could think of others. So with that in mind, I want you to reflect on this question. What legitimizes public administration? And I'm asking you to call on the readings for these past 2 weeks, weeks 4 and 5. But you might also want to integrate weeks 1 through 3, especially when we talked about Wilson and Goodnow, what they had to say. So I realize this is definitely an open-ended question. So please use this journal to work through your ideas and then develop a coherent response. So that's it for this week. I'm looking forward to reading your journals and your discussions. Thank you.